Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the program. Today, we're going to talk about human history and the advent of DNA sequencing technology and how that's rapidly changing how we find new evidence and move forward with the advancement, I guess, of knowledge when it comes to human history and origins of our species, essentially. This article is a pretty good primer for those who are still starting out in the subject. They don't know too much, but they're very interested in some of the work that's been done. But there's just so much going on. There's so many moving parts that I think this article is a pretty good, again, primer, a good intro for people just trying to get into and understand the landscape of the state of what we know about human origins, what's being debated, what's pretty much set in stone, some of the misconceptions that are out there, and some of the arguments and discussions that are going on now that are trying to suss out some of the evidence that seems to be coming out like clockwork every other day almost. I have a bunch of videos on the Denisovans and the Neanderthals and genetic drift, all of these different things that have been discovered the past year or so. And so you can refer back to those. But this video is very much going to be talking about Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens for the most part. This all centers around this idea of genetic archaeology. So right now, or for a long time anyway, archaeology was mainly whatever you can dig up from the ground that ends up becoming the core evidence of certain schools of thought, certain ideologies, certain theories, certain hypotheses. All of these things in the realm of archaeology tend to come from the ground. Since the advent of genetic sequencing technology, which we'll get into later, we could sequence different types of evidence that comes out of the ground in archaeology and sequence the DNA. And then from the DNA evidence, we can extrapolate further and gain even more evidence and replicate some of these in experiments, replicate some of these theories and hypotheses and experiments. And then from there, we can kind of come to conclusions from that. One good example of that are the Denisovans themselves, because Denisovans, although we did find, when I say we, I mean us as a human species. Obviously, I didn't find it. A piece of Denisovan, a finger bone, was found, but as far as fossil evidence goes, the discovery of Denisovans was largely because of this genetic archaeology, which we're going to talk about. It's only been in the last 30,000 years, a mere blink of an evolutionary eye, that modern humans have occupied the planet as the sole representative of the hominin lineage. Now, there's a small caveat here. I don't think this is true. I would say the last 10 to 12,000 years, modern humans have really occupied the planet as the sole representative of the hominin lineage that we know of. I mean, we can't even be sure about that. Perhaps there are other branches of the species Homo that we don't even know are around yet, because they're so, the Earth is big, and there are parts of the Earth that we haven't fully vetted out yet. We haven't really fully explored. Some of these can take the form of these really vast network of caves and underground natural caves, so to speak, jungles like the Amazon rainforest, even the Pacific Northwest. A lot of these areas have not been fully explored. There's this cave network around, I think it's modern day Vietnam and Thailand and Cambodia. Around there, there's this I forget the name of I was reading about it a few days ago. Anyway, there's this vast network of caves that has been largely untouched by humans for a long time. And they think that there were archaic humans or some form of Homo living there, and they might still be there. So there have been all kinds of different speculation about that. But anyway, it's kind of safe to say, though, that modern humans are the dominant force, are the dominant presence of the species Homo to this day, and it's been that way for about 10,000 years. Homo floresiensis is one that I can think of that has been within the last 30,000 years. Some say 12,000 to 13,000 years ago. But either way, that's neither here nor there when it comes to this article. So Within our genome are traces of genetic material from a variety of ancient humans that no longer exist. These traces reveal a long history of intermingling as our direct ancestors, which we'll call archaic humans, mated with Neanderthals and Denisovans. And some people think there are even 6, 7, 8, even 9 other humans aside from Denisovans and Neanderthals that we also intermingled with that are as yet to be identified. This is just based off of our own genetics, because remember a few episodes ago I talked about there are parts of our genome that we don't know where it came from, and that a lot of people speculate that that is some other hominin that we haven't identified yet. Because of this transformation that lies in all of our genetics, there's a larger picture that's starting to develop about how we evolved, and that we would have never known this if we had never sequenced our own DNA from the Human Genome Project, which we'll talk about in a bit. But that took 13 years to sequence our DNA, and it was a huge thing. Now we can do that pretty quickly, exponentially quicker, faster, easier, and more efficiently than we did back in the 90s. So Joshua Akey, he's this professor for integrative genomics, and he's kind of spearheading this technology. He calls his research method genetic archaeology, and he says, quote, "cultivate different types of humans, not from dirt and fossils, but directly from DNA." And this is, again, this next level, this next generation of archaeology, which, again, a lot of people have criticized archaeology as being a soft science. It's not a hard science. That means it's subject to dogma and bias and all of these things. And I would largely agree with that. And I would also say it's a developing science as well, especially if you're able to separate some of the dogma and have an open mind. So Akey's research divulges a complex history of the intermixing of early humans, indicative of several millennia of population movements across the globe. There's often a divide between researchers who go out and collect exotic samples and the researchers who do really creative theory and data analysis. So again, this is part of the reason why archaeology is hard to move forward with anything, and Egyptology falls under this as well, because data isn't really hard data because it's not accepted by another group who are mainly full of theorists, and they're ideologues essentially. And in the face of data, they're not integrating what the data says. And when you contrast archaeology with genetics is a pretty hard science, because they're able to replicate theories in a lab. They can replicate experiments rather, and outcomes of experiments. It's a very measurable, complex science. So now that archaeology is using it as a tool for good, and when I say good, I mean for unveiling truth, then it just improves the entire state of archaeology as a whole. And hopefully within a few generations, or within this generation of scholars, they can take all the good that comes from genomic archaeology, genetic archaeology, and move forward. So the long and short of genetic sequencing is basically once the order of these bases A, T, C, and G, again, adenine, guanine, all of these other components of the DNA molecule, once this order is determined, then analysts can identify the genetic information encoded in a strand of DNA. And there are other things called like shotgun sequencing, which is basically you take a bunch of different sequences of a genome and compare them. Now, obviously, this process is way shorter. So next generation sequencing came into use around 2010. So almost 10 years ago, allowed researchers to study a very large number of genetic sequences in the human genome in the fraction of the time. So like I said, the Human Genome Project took about 13 years to complete, but these new machines get this sequence data from thousands of individuals in a matter of hours. So this is the level that we're talking about here. We're getting over a decade's worth of work into a matter of hours, and now in the hands of the right people, in the hands of guys like Akey, they're trying to use it to move forward. And if concentrated correctly and funded correctly, I think there's a lot that we can stand to get out of this. The scale of the data that now can be analyzed has allowed researchers to address a whole slew of new questions that would not have been possible with the previous technology. One of these questions is the relationship between modern humans and archaic humans, such as Neanderthals. So if you're new to the debate, there was always a debate whether modern humans and Neanderthals, or Neanderthals, whatever, I use it interchangeably, a lot of the scholars of the time, especially about 100 years ago, when they found the first Neanderthal in Germany, they thought it was a completely different species. It was knuckle dragging. It was dumb. It didn't have an abstract sense of anything. There's no way that modern humans were related to this, and it was kind of a dark thing to talk otherwise. Now it's pretty much confirmed that Neanderthals and humans, not only were we related, their DNA is a part of ours, and there is gene flow back and forth between us and them. So now that we know that there's strong evidence that we're related to Neanderthals, 10 years ago, another paper came out that estimated people who weren't from Africa had 2% Neanderthal ancestry. So from that point, scientists shifted their focus on whether or not we're related to Neanderthals to where were Neanderthals throughout the earth. Let's try pinpointing where they were, and where do Africans fit into this? Were Africans part of Neanderthal? No, they're not. The Africans are their own species. That's what the thinking was, until later they discovered that Africans do have a part of the although not 2%, but they do have Neanderthal DNA within them as well, and that just changed that threw an entirely new monkey wrench into an entirely new gear that had to change another way of thinking, which is, was it out of Africa or was it into Africa and then back out of Africa again? So again, everything's muddied, but just don't let that confuse you. Because again, it doesn't change the fact about where Neanderthals were. It just changes the history of Homo sapiens and the sapiens living in Africa, how they intermingled with them. It changes that timeline. Okay. So Neanderthals lived in a wide geographical swath across Europe, Near East, and Central Asia before dying out about 30,000 years ago. They lived alongside archaic humans who evolved in Africa some 200,000 years ago. Now, again, this is hugely up for debate. For the purposes of this article, they just mention it and leave it alone, because that is a whole nother subject within this. It's a microcosm of this more this subject of sapiens and who we are in relation to Neanderthals. But first of all, here, let me just mention a couple things wrong with this, or problematic rather. Number one, Jebel or Hood, if you guys look that up, I did a video on this about a year ago. The oldest anatomically modern human remains were found in Morocco, which are dated to 315,000 years. So around here, near Gibraltar, it was found around here, near Gibraltar on the edge of the Mediterranean. There is this anatomically modern human remains that they found dated to 315,000 years ago. That's number one. Number two is, again, this humans may have, and there's evidence rising that not just genetic evidence and like haplogroup evidence, not just that, but also cave paintings and stuff, and artistic evidence that is saying that humans might have evolved elsewhere and then went into Africa later. So anyway, that's the next video about these 44,000-year-old cave paintings in Indonesia. We'll talk about that. I'm going to talk about that in the next episode after this one. So Svante Pavo and David Reich from Harvard University, they published a paper in Nature, which provides the first data employing the modern human genome to investigate the link with Neanderthals. So they used genetic variation in contemporary populations to learn about what happened in the past. And then they found out that the modern human genome, the gene sequences within the human genome, displays traits expected to have been inherited from different types of humans. So from those sequences, they compared them to Neanderthal genome looking for a match, and they were able to find all kinds of matches. They're able to trace a bunch of stuff in the human genome directly to Neanderthals and to Denisovans. And they've done this on a scale that was previously unimaginable. Again, largely because of this new technology, this next generation type of sequencing. So part of the reason why they figured out that Africans have 0.5% of Neanderthals genes is because of this technique. Some of the things that they found out were Neanderthal genome contributed to several diseases in modern human populations. So diabetes, arthritis, and celiac disease are a few that can directly be traced to Neanderthals. And there were some beneficial genes from Neanderthals as well, or neutral genes such as hair and skin color, sleep patterns, and even mood. So that's really interesting as well. Your mood, your predispositions are from a large part genetic, and certain moods, it doesn't mention which, certain moods are traced back to certain lineages of human, which is very, very interesting. There are these racial traits almost, these qualities based on your genetics that you're predisposed to. Aki has also discovered genetic fingerprints that suggest our human ancestry contains species about which we know nothing or very little. So Denisovans is one of those. They're the first species ever identified directly from their DNA. So again, it wasn't like with the Neanderthals where we just dug one up out of the ground. Denisovans are extrapolated from the data. They've established that the closest living relatives of Denisovans are modern Melanesians. Basically, my past few episodes have talked about the Melanesians, which are from New Guinea, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and Fiji. Basically, let's pull up the map here. This area here of right off the coast of Australia, off the north east coast of Australia, are these islands here. And they trace to Taiwan, which is up here more northwest. So that's very interesting as well. Again, that's neither here nor there. Aki goes on, that admixture has been a defining feature of our history. There's always been admixture, population split, and they come back together. So again, if you're thinking about out of Australia, it is possible that the humans, wherever they evolved, they went to Africa, and then they went back. The reason for this, there's a ton of reasons for this. It could be cultural reasons, it could be social reasons, but also climate reasons. And I think that's the most compelling, because we could go back and possibly find evidence based on climate data and try to connect the dots between what we find in the DNA and in fossils and other remains that could possibly be around after, almost hundreds of thousands of years almost. Aki believes that they most likely were closely related to Neanderthals, perhaps an eastern version who split off from the latter sometime around 300 to 400,000 years ago. So yeah, anyway, I'll have the link in the description. And I don't know. What do you guys think about this? I think this is great. This accelerated sequencing of DNA is huge. It's been around for about 10 years now. And there's probably a lot, just from what I can gather, there's probably a lot that's been discovered that is still being scrutinized and hasn't been published yet. But I expect 2020 to be a year just full of new revelations, new evidence, new things to cover. So let me know what you guys think. Any predictions? Is 2020 the year that we're gonna find out about a fourth member of the species Homo aside from us, Denisovans and Neanderthals? inflorescences. I mean, not the fourth, maybe like the fifth. Are we going to find more than one? Is there going to be a new old skeleton that we're going to find? A new discovery that predates the stuff that we have now. Let me know what you guys think. Stay tuned for my next episode as well. That goes with this one in a way, because it's exploring more this idea that humans may not have evolved in Africa. Maybe they evolved somewhere else and then went into Africa and then came out, or maybe there were two different types of staging areas, I guess you can call, where humans evolved separately. Who knows? Let me know what you guys think, and I'll talk to you guys later.